What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to bring you the wide receiver strength of schedule for the fantasy football playoffs. I did this exercise yesterday with running backs, so if you want to check that out, you can go ahead and do that. But basically what I'm going to be doing today is an in-depth strength of schedule look week by week and in totality of the entire fantasy playoffs, who has the best matchups, who has the worst matchups, who has the best matchups in the championship, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said yesterday, I'm not going to do the cookie cutter thing where I just say the pass defense that this guy has is 29th in the NFL against fantasy wide receivers. This should be much more informative. By using multiple sources, we can gather much more accurate information. So if you guys have watched a video like this already, I guarantee you this one will be the most valuable one that you watch. So let's not waste any more time. We're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. Okay, so let me explain what I did before I get into it so I don't confuse anybody. What I'm going to be doing in this video is breaking down each week of the fantasy playoffs, week 15, week 16, and week 17, and come up with a weighted average strength of schedule metric, and then add all three of those matchups together, week 15, week 16, and week 17, and obviously the highest number will be the best schedule. The three metrics that we're going to be using in this video are adjusted fantasy points allowed, which accounts for the schedule that they've played. So going up against a defense, if they rank, 10th in adjusted fantasy points allowed, for example, that is not skewed by who they played. Just because they played Cooper Kupp and Devontae Adams and Deebo Samuel, who are obviously going to score a lot of fantasy points, it's a lot more understandable for them to have given up a lot of fantasy points in that situation than allowing big games to Deontay Harris and the Bears wide receivers and some of these worse wide receiver cores. So that's what goes into adjusted fantasy points allowed. The second metric is pass defense DVOA. This DVOA basically means relative to an average pass defense, how much better or worse have they been? PFF coverage grade, of course, if you guys are familiar with Pro Football Focus, they grade the entire defense. They grade every player in the NFL. So they're going to look at their cornerbacks grades, their safeties grades, and their linebackers in coverage and talk about how good their coverage grades are. And that's the metric we're going to be using for that. Like I said, all those together will form the weighted average metric. I weighted adjusted fantasy points allowed 50%, and the other two, pass defense DVOA and PFF coverage grade, 25%, because we are talking about fantasy points and fantasy production here. So without further ado, that is basically what we're going to be doing. Now let's get into the week 15 matchups. As you guys can see on the screen, these are the three categories and the weighted average at the end. Brandon Cooks, the 49ers wide receivers, Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, and the Titans wide receivers, assuming either of Julio Jones or A.J. Brown is healthy, have the easiest week 15 matchup. And as you guys can see, most of these guys have green matchups across the board. They're expected to play against some bad pass defenses, some bad teams in general too, Jacksonville, Atlanta, Washington, New York, and Pittsburgh. That is great news for those guys if you have them in week 15. I talked about it yesterday, but you may have a bye week in week 15, so you may not have to win in week 15, and that's fine. But week 15 should be treated, in my opinion, as the most important week of the playoffs because it's the next week. You need to win in week 15 to get to week 16 and to get to week 17. So don't take week 15 matchups lightly and think that, oh, I have a great, championship matchup for most of my players. I'm going to be just fine. You have to get to the championship in order to reap the benefits of having a good matchup in week 17. So this is very, very important, of course. And then with DJ Moore, Michael Pittman Jr., the Bills wide receivers, Diggs, Sanders, and Beasley, Tyreek Hill, and then the Lions wide receivers, who I doubt you'd be starting anyway, but those guys have the most difficult matchups in week 15. So if you don't have a bye week, like I said, this is the most important week of the fantasy playoffs because you can't look ahead to championship week until you take care of business in week 15. So let's move on to week 16. Week 16 will be the fantasy semifinals for a lot of you and the first playoff week for anybody who does have a bye week. This will be the first matchup that you play. Elijah Moore, the Cowboys wide receivers, Tyreek Hill, Marvin Jones, and the Rams wide receivers all have the easiest matchups in week 16. Of course, as you guys can see on the screen, it is the same culprits, the Jags, the Falcons, Washington, New York, Pittsburgh. These defenses are obviously not very good against the pass. We have 13 weeks of data basically to prove that they're not very good against the pass. And in the Steelers case, it's been very, very recently that they haven't been good against the pass as well. So the Patriots wide receivers, Bills wide receivers, Diggs, Sanders, and Beasley. Bucks wide receivers, Godwin and Evans, maybe Antonio Brown if he's still with the team. Brandon Cooks and Michael Pittman Jr. These guys have the most difficult matchups in week 16. As you guys can see, they play against the Bills and the Patriots and the Panthers, Chargers, Cardinals, some of the teams that have been very, very stingy against wide receivers over the first 13 weeks of the season. Some of these matchups obviously will be a little deceiving. Of course, if you look at Justin Jefferson, who ranks about, upper to middle pack of the wide receiver matchup in week 16, he is expected to go against the Rams, who generally are not that great against fantasy wide receivers, but he probably will see shadow coverage from Jalen Ramsey in that game with no Adam Thielen, likely 2 weeks from now. Justin Jefferson might have a bit more of a difficult matchup than it actually shows there. And of course, that's some of the context that we want to provide. As I'm going through this, I'm sure you guys are looking for the receivers that you have in your fantasy league, and just remember to apply that little bit of context. Remember who is on that team in terms of shadow coverage corners and things of that nature. So we'll get into week 17, and then we'll look at this kind of as a holistic view. But this is the big one, obviously, right? I'm sure everybody wants to know that if they make the championship, how are the matchups for their wide receivers? Are the wide receivers that they have on their roster going to help them win the championship? Well, if you have the Patriots wide receivers, followed by the Bills wide receivers, Devontae Smith, Jarvis Landry, the Bucks wide receivers, so on and so forth, Devontae Adams, DK Metcalf, Cooper Kupp, Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, etc. These guys have great matchups in week 17. Cordero Patterson, Marvin Jones, the Broncos wide receivers, Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton, the Cowboys wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Amari Cooper, Justin Jefferson. These guys all have tougher matchups. So when you're looking at week 17, ideally you want your matchups to be very, very good in that week, because it's really the week that is going to win you a fantasy championship or lose it. But in the case of what we're talking about right now, we, of course, want to make the fantasy championship before we're worried about those lineups. So let's get to the full picture. This is the holistic view. And in this graph, or this chart that you guys can see on the screen, I did hide how I got to the weighted averages part because I didn't want it to take up too much space. But again, if you did skip ahead in this video and you didn't hear me explain how I got to it, it is 50% adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, 25% pass defense DVOA, and 25% PFF coverage grade against the pass. So the final column, like I said, is the cumulative strength of schedule average, or in more simple terms, the far left column and the far right column mean the same thing. So it is simply means who has the best schedule against the pass throughout the entirety of week 15 to week 17. And here are the results. So these are the dudes with the best schedules. These are the guys that should help you win a championship at your wide receiver position. Of course, hopefully you have good matchups at running back, quarterback, and tight end as well. That'll obviously contribute to you potentially winning your championship this year. But Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Deebo Samuel / Brandon Ayuk, Elijah Moore, the Rams wide receivers, again, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, AJ Brown and Julio Jones if they're on the field, Devontae Adams, et cetera, Tyreek Hill up there as well. And then on the other side of things, the guys that don't have the greatest matchups are guys like Michael Pittman Jr., DJ Moore, the Bills wide receivers, Cordero Patterson, Terry McLaurin, Hunter Renfrow, the Broncos wide receivers, the Chargers wide receivers, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this may change if you provide some context to it, right? If you have a bye or not, that could definitely skew the results in a different direction, because in my case, for example, Devontae Adams ranks 8th on this list. I have Devontae Adams on my team, but I am probably going to have a bye week. So that first matchup that he gets in week 15 is his best matchup, or one of his best matchups throughout the playoff. So I'm not going to get to reap the benefits of that great matchup for Devontae Adams. And that puts me in a little bit more of a worse situation as opposed to yesterday, like I talked about, where I have DeAndre Swift, who has a hard matchup week 15, but really, really easy matchups week 16 and 17. Therefore, me having a bye week is huge, huge news. And similarly, on the other side of things, if you guys have guys like Cooper Kupp, Hollywood Brown, DK Metcalf, Tyreek Hill, and you have a bye, then those guys are going to get their hardest matchup of the playoff schedule from week 15 to week 17 out of the way before you need to use them for your fantasy championship. And in Cooper Kupp's case, he has some really, really easy matchups for the rest of the playoffs. And I'm assuming if you have Cooper Kupp, you're probably in a decent position to get a bye because of how good he's been this year. So I hope you guys did enjoy that. I hope this was, informative to you. This wasn't really meant to be a lot of actionable advice. This is more so kind of anecdotal. If you guys have these players on your roster, I'm sure you want to know how good their playoff matchups are. But if you do want to take some action on this advice, you definitely could go in dynasty leagues. Probably, maybe you haven't had your trade deadline yet. Maybe you haven't had your trade deadline yet in your redraft leagues. Maybe go out and trade for some of these guys like Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Deebo Samuel, who's currently injured right now, Elijah Moore, DK Metcalf, who's currently at a very low point in his value, any of the Titans wide receivers, et cetera, because these guys have great playoff matchups and they could lead you to a fantasy championship. So if you're in win now mode in a dynasty league, definitely go and send some offers for these guys if you haven't had your trade deadline yet. Check out Underdog Fantasy if you guys are looking to support us in any way. You can go to Underdog Fantasy and using promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit, you'll get 100% match back on whatever you put down. If you put $25 in, you'll get $50 on the site to play with. You can go and try out some of their playoff best ball that they have going, where you draft a team basically, and a lot of strategy goes into it based on who you think is going to go furthest in the playoffs and who you think is going to be most productive during the playoffs as well. Like this video if you enjoyed, comment any of your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. We're trying to hit 10,000 subscribers ASAP. So if you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell while you're at it. Peace out, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.